My dad forced me to sit with the staff at my brother's wedding after I paid $12,000 for it. I smiled, but not because I was okay. What happened next tore open every lie my family lived behind those perfect wedding photos. My name is Michael Turner. I am 31 years old and I live in Seattle, working as a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company. On paper, my life looks stable. I rent a small apartment in Capitol Hill I run every morning before work. I know my favorite coffee order at the shop down the street. But whenever family is involved, I feel like that boy again, the one left standing in the corner while my father poured every ounce of attention into my older brother. My father, Richard Turner, is a man who believes his word is law. At 61, he carries himself with the authority of someone who spent his life leading teams and boardrooms. My mother, Margaret, is the quiet one, the one who smooths over his sharp words, who nods even when she disagrees. My brother David, at 34, has always been the golden child. Every achievement of his was praised as brilliance, while mine were quietly brushed aside. As far back as I can remember, my father would pat David on the shoulder in front of relatives and say, "This one is the future of our family." My name was barely an afterthought. I can still recall my 12th birthday. David had just won some regional debate contest, and the entire party turned into a celebration of him. My father lifted a glass of champagne and toasted to his son, while I sat in front of a cake with my name written in cheap icing. It was the first time I understood what it felt like to be erased. That feeling followed me into adulthood, woven into every gathering, every holiday, every family event. It did not matter that I had built a career for myself in software, or that I paid my own bills since college, or that I kept my life clean and steady. To my father, what mattered was the image. David became a financial consultant in Portland, polished, smooth-talking, always ready with a practiced smile. To him, I was just the other son, the quiet one in the background. Even my mother, who loved me in her own way, never raised her voice against my father's favoritism. Silence was her shield. By the spring of 2023, the family had a new focus. David's wedding to Olivia Bennett, a 26-year-old event manager who carried herself with grace and poise. She knew how to charm my parents from the moment she met them. My father treated her like she was already part of some dynasty, someone who would polish the Turner name even brighter. When it came to planning the wedding, Richard and Olivia took control of every detail, from the venue in Bellevue overlooking Lake Washington to the guest list that seemed to include half the city's business elite. I wanted to help. Maybe it was foolish, but I thought that if I could contribute, they might see me differently. So I wrote a check for $12,000 to cover the catering bill. I spoke with the chef myself, arranged the payment, and handed the receipt to my father. He barely glanced at it before tucking it into a folder. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just a nod, as if it was expected of me. Still, I held on to the hope that this gesture would matter. Beyond that, I set aside another $7,000 for their honeymoon fund. I imagined Olivia and David opening the envelope during their trip, realizing I had cared enough to invest in their future. It was money I could have used for my own plans, but I told myself that family meant sacrifice, even when it was rarely returned. At night, I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head. Maybe my father would finally say he was proud of me. Maybe David would look at me not as the brother who lingered in his shadow, but as someone who stood beside him. Maybe Olivia would smile and tell me I had made their day brighter. These were small fantasies, but they kept me steady. One evening, I stopped by my parents' house in Redmond. The dining room was filled with seating charts, flower samples, and stacks of invitations. Olivia sat at the head of the table like she had already become the matriarch, and my father hovered beside her, nodding at her every suggestion. I stood in the doorway holding an envelope with the honeymoon contribution. Olivia looked up and said, "Oh, Michael, perfect timing, we were just discussing table arrangements." My father added, "Your brother's wedding has to reflect who we are. Let's make sure everything is flawless." I swallowed the words I wanted to say. I wanted to ask where my place was in all this. Instead, I placed the envelope on the table and said quietly, "This is for you both." My father's eyes flicked down, then back up to Olivia, already moving on to the next detail. David gave me a casual nod, the kind you might give to a coworker who had finished a minor task. I stood there for a moment, invisible in my own family's home, then excused myself. Driving back across the bridge into Seattle, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. $12,000 for catering, $7,000 more for the honeymoon, and still not a word of gratitude. Yet I kept telling myself that maybe on the day of the wedding things would change. Maybe my seat at that celebration would finally be at their side, not hidden in the shadows. I know how it sounds. Desperate, naive, like a child still chasing approval that would never come. But in my mind, it was simple. I just wanted to prove that I mattered, that my presence in this family was not something to be brushed away like it always had been. And as I stared at the skyline flickering in the distance that night, one truth pressed itself into my chest with a weight I could not ignore. I only wanted to show them that I was important too. That was all I had ever wanted. I started picking up extra shifts at the office long after the others had gone home. My team worked on a software rollout for a logistics company, and most of the engineers left by 6. I stayed until 10 staring at lines of code, fixing bugs, pushing updates, anything that meant I could bill more hours. When I finally shut down my computer, the cleaners were already running their vacuums, nodding politely as I walked past. Those nights stretched one into the next, my dinner often a vending machine sandwich eaten in the parking garage. Vacations came and went. Colleagues planned ski trips in Colorado or weekend getaways to Napa. I kept declining, telling them maybe next time, knowing there would be no next time. Every hour I banked went toward that $12,000. I told myself it was temporary, that once the wedding was over and everyone saw how much I had given, maybe they would finally treat me differently. Ethan noticed before anyone else did. We had been friends since college, and he had this way of looking at me that made it impossible to hide things. One night, after I pushed away a second beer at O'Malley's bar, he leaned across the booth. "You look worn out, man. What are you killing yourself for?" I shrugged, pretending not to understand. He didn't buy it. "It's for David, isn't it? And Olivia. You're paying for their wedding stuff." I looked down at my hands. My nails were short, my fingers stiff from too many nights at the keyboard. "It's just the catering," I said. "And the honeymoon fund. I can handle it." Ethan shook his head, incredulous. "Handle it? You already sacrificed half your 20s for a family that never gave you credit. Remember the trust fund I did? That memory was carved into me. Richard sat us both down when we were teenagers. He laid out the numbers, the savings my grandfather had left for us. Then he said David would need most of it for Yale. I still remember the way he said it, like it was obvious, like I shouldn't even question it. I got what was left, just enough for community college and a few semesters at State. I tried to brush it off with Ethan now. That was years ago. Things are different. "Different," he said. "No, Mike. They are the same. David gets the seat at the table. You get the scraps." I didn't have an answer, so I just sipped water and forced a laugh. He looked at me the way he did when we were younger, when he wanted to shake sense into me, but knew I wouldn't listen. A week later, Olivia's email landed in my inbox. Subject line, "Thank you for your generosity." I opened it eagerly, thinking maybe she was finally acknowledging me. The message was 3 sentences long, polite but cold, the kind of thing you send to a vendor. She thanked me for the contribution, mentioned how helpful it was to cover costs, and closed with, "Looking forward to seeing you at the wedding." My stomach tightened as I scrolled to the bottom. She had CC'd my father and only my father. No one else in the family. The tone wasn't that of a future sister-in-law. It was more like a corporate client acknowledging a sponsor. I sat at my desk staring at the email for a long time. My apartment around me felt smaller than usual, the hum of the refrigerator too loud, the clock ticking against my ears. For a moment I imagined hitting reply, typing out everything I felt, demanding to be seen as more than a checkbook. My fingers hovered over the keys before I closed the laptop. Later that evening, Ethan called. I could hear the noise of the city behind him. "Did you get the thank you note?" he asked. I told him yes. He sighed, a sound full of frustration. Mike, open your eyes. They don't see you as family. You are the wallet. That's it. I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. The truth was too sharp. My chest felt heavy, my pulse loud in my ears. I paced the living room until the carpet fibers bent under my steps, replaying the email again and again in my mind. The $12,000 wasn't just money. It was nights of exhaustion, weekends spent alone, years of trying to prove I belonged. And in 3 sentences, Olivia had reduced it to a transaction. I didn't delete the email. I kept it like proof of something I couldn't yet admit to myself. That maybe Ethan was right. That maybe I had only ever been a line item to them, another cost they could pass along, another favor they could demand. The thought stayed with me, quietly gnawing as the wedding date crept closer. The drive to Portland stretched out in silence for long stretches, the hum of the tires filling the empty space between me and Ethan. He tried to lighten the mood now and then, cracking a joke about traffic or pointing out some odd roadside sign, but I wasn't much of a conversationalist that morning. My chest felt tight, as though the closer we got, the less air I could take in. When we finally pulled into the hotel garage near the venue, my palms were damp on the steering wheel. The venue was a downtown ballroom draped in white lights and polished marble floors. Guests in tailored suits and glittering dresses swept past us as if they belonged to another world. Ethan nudged me as we walked toward the check-in table. He gave me a look, a subtle reminder that I wasn't walking into this alone. I handed my name to the young woman at the table. She scanned the list, frowned, and shuffled through a stack of envelopes. At last, she pulled one out and slid it across to me with a strained smile. I opened it and stared at the words printed in neat block letters, "Vendor access only." I blinked, sure there had been some mistake. Before I could ask, I felt a hand on my shoulder. My father's voice came low but sharp enough to cut through the bustle around us. "That's correct. You'll be seated with the staff. That section fits you better." Ethan spun around, his face flushing red. "Are you serious?" he snapped. "He paid for this. He paid for that food you're serving." Richard didn't even look at him. His gaze stayed fixed on me, cold and unwavering. "This is the arrangement," he said, simply, then turned back toward the crowd, as if he had something more important to attend to. I caught a flicker of movement from the edge of the crowd. My mother, Margaret, stood a few feet back, her hands clasped together, her eyes darting between me and my father. For one moment I thought she might speak, but then she lowered her gaze and slipped into the ballroom without a word. Ethan's jaw tightened. He muttered a curse under his breath, then turned to me. "You don't have to accept this." I forced a smile that barely reached my lips. "It's fine. Let's just go inside." Inside, the air buzzed with chatter and clinking glasses. Waiters moved swiftly with trays of champagne. A string quartet played near the stage. I held the pass in my hand like a brand, my fingers tightening around it, as if it could disappear if I pressed hard enough. We moved toward the seating chart, a massive white board with elegant gold lettering listing every table and the names neatly scripted beside them. My eyes scanned row after row, table after table. Turner Richard, Turner Margaret, Bennett Olivia, and then line after line of distant relatives and old family friends. My name wasn't there. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low. "Do you see it anywhere?" I shook my head slowly. "No." As if on cue, David approached from the side of the chart. His tuxedo was perfectly fitted, his hair styled in the effortless way that had always made people describe him as charming. He glanced at the board, then at the pass in my hand. His eyes lingered for just a second, and I thought I saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe even guilt. But he didn't say anything. He smoothed his tie and moved on, offering warm greetings to the next couple who walked past. Ethan exhaled sharply, his voice barely controlled. He knows. He saw it. And he's not saying a damn thing. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I kept my expression neutral, the same polite smile plastered on my face. If I let the mask slip even a little, the anger and hurt bubbling under the surface would pour out in front of everyone. And that was the one thing I couldn't afford. We walked toward the far side of the room where a row of folding chairs had been set up against the wall near the catering station. I could see the staff already gathered there, chatting quietly, some checking their phones on breaks between serving. That was where my father thought I belonged. That was the seat assigned to me at my brother's wedding. I lowered myself into one of the chairs, the fabric of my suit pulling tight across my shoulders. My chest rose and fell steadily, each breath measured, deliberate. Ethan sat beside me, still fuming, muttering under his breath about respect and decency. I let my eyes wander back to the glittering tables spread across the ballroom. Every seat was filled with smiling guests, raising glasses, clinking silverware, leaning in close to share laughter. My own place was absent, as if I didn't exist. And still I smiled. I walked through the ballroom with the lanyard still dangling against my chest, the word vendor stamped in black. It felt heavier than any chain. Guests in tuxedos and sequined gowns clinked their glasses, the air filled with chatter and the faint notes of the string quartet. Waiters weaved between tables carrying trays of champagne. I found myself standing at the edges, neither guest nor worker, a shadow among glitter. Ethan caught my eye from across the room. He had been given a proper seat with the rest of the friends, and his jaw was tight as he raised his brows at me. I gave him a small shake of the head and tried to smile, though my chest felt hollow. He looked like he might get up, but I waved him back. I couldn't let him fight this battle for me. When the lights dimmed slightly, Olivia stepped up to the podium. Her ivory dress shimmered under the chandeliers. She smiled with the kind of polished warmth she always managed to summon in public. David stood at her side, hand over hers, as she held the microphone. "We want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight," she said, her voice clear and sweet. "This day means the world to us, and it wouldn't be possible without the love and support from family and friends who have always believed in us." Her gaze swept the room, pausing on faces at the front tables, lingering on Richard and Margaret. She never once looked toward the back corner where I stood. David smiled, leaning down to kiss her cheek as the guests applauded. I clapped along slow and stiff as though I were clapping for strangers. The smell of roast beef and garlic butter wafted from the buffet line, making my stomach turn. I had skipped lunch, too nervous to eat, and now the irony bit deep. I had paid for this feast, yet my seat was with the people carrying plates to the guests. A man in a black vest approached me. His clipboard was pressed against his chest, and he carried the air of someone who didn't have time to argue. "You're Michael, correct?" he asked. I nodded. "I'll need you to sign the balance for catering. Just procedure, since the card on file is yours." The words hit me like a slap. Guests were laughing and raising their glasses around us while I scribbled my name on a receipt. My hand shook as I pressed the pen, the numbers staring back at me. $12,000. $12,000 for them to make me invisible. The man thanked me and left. I stood still, pen heavy in my hand, the chatter of the ballroom muffled as if I were underwater. My chest felt tight. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught somewhere deep in my throat. I walked slowly toward the gift table. White envelopes and ribboned boxes stacked neatly, each tagged with names. Mine lay on top, a cream envelope holding $7,000 in crisp bills I had withdrawn days before. I had thought it would make a statement, a way of showing that I was part of this family, even if they didn't see me. Now it burned in my hands. I gripped the envelope, my pulse hammering. Guests turned as they noticed me standing there, the vendor tag glaring from my chest. The string quartet faltered slightly, as if even the music felt the weight in the air. Olivia was laughing with a group of her friends nearby when she caught sight of me. Her smile froze. I lifted the envelope high enough for every eye around the table to see. My voice came out louder than I expected, raw and steady at once. "You don't need this anymore." The room fell into a hush. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks stilled above plates. Olivia's eyes widened, her hand slipping from the champagne flute. Richard stood a few feet behind her, his face hardening into something between shock and fury. I laid the envelope flat on the table, then slid it back into my jacket pocket. For a moment, the silence pressed so heavy it was almost a roar. Then the whispers began, sharp and cutting, guests turning to one another in ripples of disbelief. Olivia's lips parted as if she might respond, but no words came. Richard stepped forward, his jaw tight, but even he looked rattled. Margaret sat frozen at her table, eyes darting between us, torn between her husband and me. The heat of the lights pressed against my skin. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. For the first time that night, I didn't smile to hide. I let the truth of my place be seen, and I let them all sit with it. The whispers grew louder, spreading through the ballroom like fire catching dry grass. Guests leaned closer to one another, their eyes flicking toward me, toward the envelope, toward the groom and bride who had chosen silence over acknowledgement. I didn't move. I let the weight of the moment hang heavy and undeniable. The morning light crept through the blinds of my hotel room, sharp and uninviting. My phone buzzed against the nightstand. I blinked, still heavy with exhaustion, and reached for it. The first message lit the screen. "Richard, don't make this into a bigger deal than it was." A second followed right after. "Margaret. Everything was just an oversight, nothing intentional." Then another. "David. I didn't mean for it to happen. Just let it go." I read them twice. Not one word of apology. Not a single, "I'm sorry." Just instructions to be quiet, to minimize what they had done, as if the humiliation in front of 100 guests was something I could fold up and tuck into my back pocket. My chest tightened, but my face remained still. Later that day, I drove across town to my parents' house. The driveway was crowded with leftover rental cars and floral arrangements already wilting in the sun. Inside, the air smelled of champagne and extinguished candles. Olivia sat stiffly at the kitchen island, her makeup faintly smeared under her eyes. David was beside her, scrolling on his phone, his jaw tense. Richard leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, while Margaret hovered by the sink, drying a plate that was already dry. I set my phone down on the counter. No one met my eyes right away. Richard was the first to break the silence. "Michael, you're a grown man. Being an adult means learning to forget things. Last night is behind us. Let's not drag it out." His voice was calm, practiced the same tone he used when delivering verdicts in family arguments that always favored someone else. Olivia glanced up, then back down at the granite surface, her lips pressed together. David shifted uncomfortably, then muttered, "I wasn't trying to hurt you. It was complicated." He didn't elaborate, and he didn't look at me. I waited. Margaret finally turned her hands, twisting the dish towel. "I don't want this to turn into a war," she whispered. Her eyes darted to Richard, then back to me. She looked small in that moment, smaller than I had ever seen her. But even then, she didn't step forward, didn't stand between us, didn't claim me as her son in the way I had silently prayed for. The room held its breath. I let the silence stretch until it nearly cracked. Then I smiled, slow and deliberate, though my chest burned. "Maybe I'll change my mind," I said quietly. My voice was even unthreatening, as if I were conceding. Richard nodded once, satisfied, already believing the storm had passed. Margaret exhaled as though she had been waiting for my surrender. Olivia blinked, relief flickering across her face, while David let out a short laugh, almost nervous. "They thought I meant I'd return the money. They thought I was about to fold, to slide the envelope back across the table to erase the scene I had made the night before. They thought, as always, that I would retreat. But I said nothing more. I let them sit in their assumptions. Their shoulders eased, the room shifted, and the weight of expectation moved away from me, at least for now. I folded the dish towel neatly, placed it beside Margaret, and walked toward the door. Behind me, no one called my name. And still I smiled. The apartment was silent when I got home, only the faint hum of the fridge filling the space. I set the stack of papers from the catering company on the table and sat down, staring at the lines I had signed just days before. I flipped to the back and read each clause slowly, careful not to miss a word. My eyes caught a section I had skimmed before, something bolded in small print, almost decorative at first glance. Satisfaction guarantee within 24 hours. Guest of honor treatment guaranteed. Failure to deliver would result in a full refund. I leaned back in the chair and let out a long breath. Guest of honor. I laughed under my breath, thinking about the tray shoved into my hands, the vendor tag clipped to my shirt, the way I had been called over to sign a receipt while Olivia toasted her guests. Guest of honor. I had been invisible. The phone sat by my elbow, heavy with possibility. I dialed the number at the bottom of the page. A cheerful voice answered a young woman with rehearsed politeness. I gave her my name and the invoice number. She pulled it up quickly, probably not expecting anything unusual. I explained what had happened, how I had been humiliated at the event I had paid for, how I had been treated as less than a guest. There was silence for a moment on the other end before she cleared her throat. Mr. Miller, we take these clauses seriously. You're entitled to cancel and request a refund. Would you like to proceed? Yes, I said, steady. Cancel the entire amount, $12,000. The call ended with confirmation in my inbox minutes later. $12,000 released back to my account. I stared at the screen and felt a quiet thrill ripple through me. It was not revenge. It was simply the truth written in their own contract now turned back on them. The following morning I pictured the scene when the notice hit Richard's email. I imagined him sitting at his desk, Olivia beside him, David flipping through his phone. Their names tied to the account, now not mine. Their responsibility to pay. I could almost hear the tone of Richard's voice, clipped and sharp, barking at Olivia about oversight at David, about weakness at Margaret, about silence. Later that afternoon, David called me. I let it ring twice before picking up. His voice was low, urgent, almost pleading. Michael, what are you doing? We got a notice about the catering bill. They're saying we're liable. $12,000. Are you serious? I am serious, I said evenly. It's all in the contract. Guest of honor treatment. That wasn't delivered. I used the rights they gave me. There was a pause, then the sound of him exhaling hard into the phone. Dad says you're just trying to stir trouble. That you'll come to your senses if you think about it. Your dad thinks wrong, I said. I'm not stirring anything. I'm protecting myself. His voice broke slightly, the calm slipping. Is there any way to fix this? Some other arrangement? You should ask Richard, I replied. He seems to know everything. I could almost hear the color rise in his face. Before he could answer, I ended the call. That evening my phone buzzed again, this time with Richard's number. I let it sit on the table until it went to voicemail. When I finally listened, his voice was sharp and controlled, words chosen like weapons. You think you're clever, Michael. But you're not. You've embarrassed this family enough. If you don't reverse this by tomorrow, I'll sue. Don't test me. I replayed the message once more, then deleted it. He thought fear was still his best tool. He hadn't realized I had stopped being afraid a long time ago. The next day, I met with Thomas Reed at his office downtown. The walls were lined with case files and the faint smell of coffee hung in the air. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a calm smile. He had been Emily's friend in law school, now a respected attorney known for handling cases where intimidation was the weapon of choice. I laid out the papers, the contract, the threats, the voicemail. He read them in silence, only nodding occasionally. Finally, he looked up. They can't touch you, he said simply. You acted within the contract. If they try to sue, we'll respond with an anti-slap. That's not just defense, it's offense. It forces them to cover your fees if they push baseless claims. His words settled over me like armor. I nodded slowly, feeling the corners of my mouth pull into a quiet smile. Then I'm ready, I said. Thomas leaned back, folding his hands. Michael, this isn't about the $12,000. This is about control. They wanted you small, grateful, quiet. You broke that pattern. Be prepared for noise. I've lived with their noise my whole life, I told him. Silence was worse. Now at least I can hear myself think. We shook hands again, and I left his office, the late afternoon sun spilling gold on the streets outside. For the first time in years, my steps felt steady, not rushed, not hesitant. I had drawn a line and stood behind it. When I got back home, the apartment was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. I opened my laptop and saw the refund still sitting fresh in my account. I closed the screen gently and poured myself a glass of water, the simplest kind of toast. The phone buzzed once more, flashing Richard's name. I let it ring until it stopped and set the glass down without taking a sip. The next morning, I woke to a string of messages from Olivia. The first was short. "Please, call me." Then another. "If I apologize, will you stop the chargeback?" She had written it at nearly 3 a.m. The tone was desperate, stripped of the polished confidence she usually carried like armor. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the screen. For the first time since all of this started, I felt the weight shifting. They were the ones reaching out, not me. I called her back, and after a few rings, she picked up, her voice rough like she had been crying. "Michael," she said, "if I make a public apology, if I admit I was wrong, will you cancel it? Richard is furious. He says we can fight it, but I know we'll lose. Please." I leaned back against the headboard and let her words hang. I had waited years for even a sliver of accountability, and now it was dangling in front of me. But I knew a private phone call wasn't enough. They had humiliated me in front of everyone. A whispered sorry would not balance the scale. "If you want me to stop," I said slowly, "then you need to post it. Facebook. Public. Clear. I want everyone to see it." There was silence, only her shallow breath. "That's humiliating." I almost laughed. "That's the point, Olivia. You all didn't think twice about humiliating me. If you want this to end, you know what to do." She didn't argue, only whispered, "I'll think about it before hanging up." By noon, the post was up. It was short, stiff, and clearly written with Richard's disapproval pressing on her shoulders, but it was there. "I want to acknowledge that I wronged my brother-in-law, Michael. At the wedding, my choices and words caused him pain. I should have treated him with kindness, and I failed." Within minutes, comments flooded in. Old friends of the family, people from church, neighbors. Some expressed shock. Others offered support to me, tagging my name even though I never replied. The facade of the Turner family began to crack in the most public way possible. That Sunday, Pastor John Miller cornered Richard at the end of service. I wasn't there, but Emily was, and she told me what she saw. The pastor stood with his hand heavy on Richard's shoulder, asking straight out, "What happened with Michael? Why did Olivia have to write that?" The congregation noticed. People are asking questions. Richard brushed him off, his jaw tight, but the damage was already spreading. Later that evening, David called me, his voice sharp at first. "You made Olivia a laughingstock. You pushed her into this. Everyone's talking about us." I listened in silence until his anger thinned into something weaker. Then I asked, "Did you read the comments?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was different. Lower. Tired. "Yeah. I read them. And..." He let out a long breath. "Some of them, they weren't wrong." For the first time, David didn't defend his wife or his parents. He just let the silence hang, and I knew the foundation under him was shifting, even if he wasn't ready to admit it out loud. That night, I scrolled through Olivia's post again. I read the names of people who had never once spoken up for me before now, chiming in with words of support, with surprise, with quiet judgment at the family they thought they knew. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt something colder, sharper. This was only the beginning. 2 days later, Richard called me directly. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the rage bubbling underneath. "You've turned this into a circus. Do you understand what you've done to this family's name?" I let him speak, let him spit out every word about honor and legacy, until he finally snapped. "This is slander, Michael. You've dragged the Turner name through the mud." I almost smiled at the irony. All I said was, "No, Richard." Olivia told the truth. "That's not slander. That's confession." The line went silent, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was shaking with fury. "You think you've won something, but you've done nothing but shame your own blood." I didn't answer. He hung up on me, and for the first time I didn't feel like the one left standing alone. Because now everyone was watching, and the Turner family's perfect image was unraveling in public. And I knew Richard would not let it rest. The call came 2 days later while I was reviewing a design draft in my office at Harrison & Lowe Architects in downtown Chicago. Rachel Moore from HR knocked lightly before stepping in, a careful look on her face. She carried a notepad, which meant this wasn't casual. "Michael, I need to talk to you about something unusual," she said, lowering herself into the chair across from me. She folded her hands and glanced down as if she was rehearsing. "We received a phone call this morning from your father." My stomach tightened. Rachel wasn't the type to exaggerate. "What did he say?" I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. She shifted uncomfortably. "He insisted that you're not stable, that you have tendencies that make you unfit for your role here. He suggested the firm review your employment." I leaned back, letting the weight of her words settle. Rachel's tone carried no judgment, only professionalism. She looked almost embarrassed to be repeating it. "He said that," I asked, my voice steady. She nodded. "I want to be clear, Michael. We do not take these calls seriously. What your father did was highly inappropriate. I've documented it and placed it in your file, not against you, but as a record of outside interference." I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank you, Rachel. I know this isn't something you should have to deal with." Rachel gave a small smile. "Families can be complicated. Just know we see you for the professional you are. That's what matters here." When she left, I stared at the drafting table, my pencil frozen above the page. My father had moved beyond humiliating me at a wedding or trying to control appearances. He had crossed into my livelihood. He wanted to strip away the one place I had carved out for myself, the space where his reach didn't extend. The anger came slowly, not as a flame, but as a steady tide rising in my chest. He wanted me diminished, dependent, erased. I would not let him. That evening, I walked the short distance to Thomas Reed's law office. His firm occupied a modest building in Oak Park. Nothing flashy, just a brass plaque by the door. Thomas was a friend of Emily's from law school, and since the wedding debacle, he had become my anchor in navigating the storms my father unleashed. Thomas greeted me with a firm handshake, his desk already cluttered with folders. "You said this was urgent." "It is," I said, settling into the chair. "My father called HR at my firm, tried to paint me as unstable. Rachel documented it, but I need to be ready if he keeps pushing." Thomas leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "He's not just after your reputation socially. He's targeting your career now. That's escalation." "Exactly. I need a record legal backing. If he tries again, I want him to know there are consequences." Thomas tapped his pen against the desk. "I can draft a letter warning against further interference. We'll also prepare to pursue an anti-SLAPP motion if he tries any frivolous claims. Your father thrives on intimidation, but courts don't tolerate harassment disguised as concern." I nodded, feeling a small surge of relief. Knowing someone had my back made the weight easier to carry. Thomas looked at me closely. "You have to decide how far you're willing to go. He may not stop until he feels he's broken you." "I know," I said quietly. "And I'm not going to let him." As I walked home, the cold evening air cut through my jacket, bracing me. The streets were lined with bare trees, the kind that looked skeletal under the streetlights. I thought about how far Richard was willing to go. He didn't just want to win an argument. He wanted me to vanish from the picture entirely. Back at my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand. The silence was heavy. I thought about David, about Olivia, about the way they had begun to falter when the truth seeped into public view. And now, instead of retreating, my father doubled down. He had always seen control as his birthright. I remembered Rachel's careful words, her insistence that the firm valued my work. That was mine. That was earned. And I would not let Richard poison it. I poured myself a glass of water and stared at the city lights outside my window. Somewhere in the distance, car horns echoed faintly, life carrying on indifferent to the battles inside one family. This was not just about a ruined wedding or a chargeback on a catering bill. It was war in slow motion, with each move calculated to erode me. I took a sip, steadying myself. For the first time, I understood that my father's campaign wasn't about pride. It was about elimination. And that realization cut deeper than anything he had ever said to me. I sat there until the water turned warm in the glass, thinking of my next move, knowing this was only the beginning of what he had planned. Sunday morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of Grace Baptist, painting the pews in muted colors. I sat at the back, listening, but not praying. Pastor John Miller's sermon was on forgiveness, his words aimed more at me than the congregation. After the service, he found me by the doors. His hand on my shoulder was firm but gentle. He said reconciliation was God's path, that a sit-down with my family could heal wounds. I told him no. My voice didn't waver. I said reconciliation would only strip me of my voice, reduce my pain to a misunderstanding when it was deliberate cruelty. His brow furrowed, and for a moment he looked like he wanted to argue, but then he just nodded and let me walk away. I could feel the weight of eyes on my back as I left the church. People whispered, not loud enough to catch every word, but enough to sting. Some looked at me with pity, others with judgment. In a small town, the walls always had ears, and nothing stayed private for long. That evening I heard a knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, Margaret stood there, her hands trembling against her coat. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes rimmed red. She asked if she could come in. I stepped aside, unsure of what she wanted. She sat at my kitchen table, running her fingers over the edge of a mug I hadn't offered her anything to drink in. She said she had kept quiet to keep the family together, that silence was her way of protecting peace. She looked at me with pleading eyes, asking me to understand. I told her that silence wasn't peace, it was betrayal. My words came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't pull them back. I told her that by saying nothing, she had stood with them, that every time she turned her head away from Richard's cruelty, she chose his side. Margaret broke then. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her face, and for the first time I saw my mother cry without restraint. Her sobs filled the kitchen, and I sat there with a cold heaviness in my chest. When she finally spoke again, her voice was broken. She said she never meant to hurt me, that she thought ignoring Richard's temper was survival. I told her maybe for her it was, but for me it was erasure. I was the one left sitting with staff at a wedding I paid for. I was the one made into an afterthought at every family gathering. She bowed her head, unable to meet my eyes. The following week, I noticed the shift in town. At the grocery store, Mrs. Thompson asked me if it was true what Olivia had written on Facebook. At the gas station, two men lowered their voices as I passed, but not low enough to hide the word shame. Even at work, a colleague glanced at me with that same blend of curiosity and discomfort. My private wounds had become public entertainment. David reached out a few days later, asking if we could meet for lunch. We sat at a diner off Main Street, the kind of place where the booths squeaked and the coffee tasted burnt. But everyone knew everyone. He looked tired, his wedding ring glinting under the dim lights. He said he hated seeing Olivia humiliated online, hated that people were talking about our family like a scandal. He told me I had made it harder for him, that I should think about what my actions were doing to them. I stared at him across the table, unable to believe he still didn't see it. I asked him, what about me? What about what they had done to me? His jaw tightened, and he said he didn't want to take sides. He said he just wanted things to quiet down. I told him not choosing was choosing. He looked away, pushing the last of his fries around his plate, his silence louder than any answer. Word spread quickly. Some people defended me, saying I deserved better after what happened at the wedding. Others muttered that I should let it go, that families fight. But then Pastor Miller raised the issue again during a Bible study group, asking openly if silence in the face of cruelty made someone complicit. He didn't name Margaret, but everyone knew who he meant. My mother stopped attending church for 2 Sundays after that. By then, the Turner name was no longer untouchable. Richard still walked around town with his chin high, but the whispers trailed behind him. Olivia avoided the farmer's market altogether, embarrassed by the stares. Margaret barely left the house. For years they had controlled the family narrative, and now it was unraveling in front of neighbors and friends. I sat alone on my porch one evening, the cicadas buzzing in the summer heat. The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. I thought about my mother's tears, my brother's silence, and the pastor's probing questions. The truth was out in the open now, and it wasn't just my family who had to live with it. The community was starting to ask questions they had never dared ask before. And for the first time, I wondered if my mother would ever forgive herself, or if forgiveness even mattered anymore. The message came from Lucas Bennett late on a Thursday night. He asked if we could meet the next morning away from town somewhere quiet. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I read it. Lucas had always struck me as careful, loyal to his work and to family obligations, but there was something in the way he wrote that told me he was carrying a weight too heavy to keep. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of Franklin, the kind of place where the coffee tasted burnt, but the booths offered privacy. He was already there when I arrived, fidgeting with a napkin, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. I slid into the booth across from him, the vinyl seat sticking to the back of my shirt. He didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone, hands trembling slightly, and pushed it toward me. On the screen was an email thread. Olivia had written the words in black and white, plain as day. "We need his money, not his presence." And beneath it, my father's reply. Perfect. I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a moment as the anger rose in my chest. It was one thing to suspect another, to see it written like a transaction. Lucas's voice cut through my thoughts. "They told me to stay quiet, Michael. Olivia said if I said a word, I'd never work another event in this county again. Richard told me I didn't know how families handled things, that I'd regret crossing him." I leaned back, the booth creaking under my weight. "Why are you showing me this now? Because I can't carry it anymore," he said. "I've seen what it's done to you, and I can't let them bury it. I thought I could ignore it, but every time I watched them smile in church or host dinners like nothing happened, it ate at me." His voice cracked, and he gripped his coffee cup like it was an anchor. I believed him. He wasn't playing me, he wasn't angling for anything. He just wanted out of the cage they'd built around him. I scrolled further down the thread. There were text messages too, Olivia pressing him to change schedules to keep me from appearing anywhere near the ceremony. One read, "Just remember he paid. That's enough." Richard followed up with, "Keep it tight. No slip-ups." I felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate plan, a coordinated effort to erase me while taking everything I gave. "Do you realize what this means?" I asked him. He nodded. "It means they can't deny it anymore." The waitress came by, refilled our cups, and left without a word. For a moment the silence between us was heavy, filled only by the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation from the counter. "They think they own the story," Lucas whispered, his eyes fixed on the table. "But this is proof. You can do whatever you want with it." I slid the phone back across the table. "Forward those to me. Every email, every message. If they've threatened you, I'll make sure you're protected." He nodded quickly, almost with relief, and I realized how long he had been waiting to hand this burden over. As I left the diner, the morning sun breaking through the blinds, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I had carried suspicion, anger, humiliation, but now I had something tangible. Evidence that they had plotted, not stumbled. Evidence that my father's cruelty and Olivia's ambition had converged into a single truth. Back in my car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, the echo of their words ringing in my head. "We need his money, not his presence." Perfect. It was the kind of sentence that stripped away every mask, every polite smile, every false apology. It was the kind of sentence that ended families or remade them entirely. Lucas texted me minutes later. "Files sent. Be careful." I opened my email and saw the attachments. My chest tightened as I clicked through them, each one a nail in the coffin of their story. The chain was complete, their intent undeniable. I knew then that the balance had shifted. They thought I was the quiet son, the one they could humiliate and dismiss. But with these messages, their carefully constructed facade was cracked wide open. I sat there in the parking lot, phone heavy in my hand, and for the first time since that wedding, I felt the tide turning. Not in whispers, not in rumors, but in hard, undeniable truth. The question was no longer whether they had wronged me. The question was what I would do with the proof now sitting in my inbox. And as the engine hummed to life, I realized there was no going back to silence. The first time David knocked on my door after Lucas handed me the proof, I almost didn't open it. I could see him through the peephole shoulders, slumped a man carrying a weight that no charm or excuses could shake off. When I finally let him in, he didn't sit. He stood in the middle of my living room, clutching his phone like it was a lifeline. He opened the email Lucas had given me, the one with Olivia's name written plain as day. His hands trembled as he read, his lips moving silently until he finally whispered that one sentence I had never expected to hear. "You were right." The words came out broken, like they had cut his throat on the way out. I stared at him, searching for a trace of mockery, but there was none. His face was pale, his eyes raw. For the first time since this began, my brother looked like he understood what it meant to be betrayed by the people closest to you. "I didn't want to believe it," he said, lowering himself onto the edge of the couch. "I defended her. I defended him. I told myself you were bitter, angry that you couldn't let go of the past. But this is her handwriting. And Dad, replying like it was nothing. They didn't just forget you, Mike. They erased you." I didn't answer right away. I let him sit with the silence because silence had been my companion far longer than his. Finally, I told him the truth. It was never about forgetting me. It was about convenience. I was inconvenient, so they wrote me out. And you played along, David. You wanted peace more than truth. His head dropped into his hands. I thought I was protecting the family. I didn't realize I was helping them destroy it. In that moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But pity had no place here. Months passed after that night, and for the first time in years, David and I barely spoke. Not out of hostility, but because every word between us carried a weight neither of us could hold for long. Then one morning in early spring, I got a short message from him. "Filed today." Attached was a copy of the divorce petition. Olivia had been served. I sat at my kitchen table staring at it, the steam from my coffee curling upward like a fragile thread. My brother had finally severed himself from the woman who had gutted me for her own gain. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like inevitability. When Richard found out, his fury came quick. He left voicemail after voicemail, his voice rising until it cracked. Margaret tried softer calling in the evenings, begging me to come to the house to at least talk. I didn't pick up. I changed my number, rerouted my accounts, cut every financial tie they could ever try to pull on. At the hospital HR desk, I signed new papers to replace my emergency contact. Emily's name was the one I wrote. It felt like lifting a stone off my chest. The world grew quieter after that. Not empty, but clean. Emily noticed it too. She came by one evening with takeout dropping cartons on the counter before perching on the stool across from me. She studied me like she always did when she wanted to measure how far I'd come. "You think cutting them off is revenge?" she said softly. "But it isn't. Revenge is chasing what they did until it eats you. This isn't that. This is freedom. You got your life back, Michael. That's the only payback that matters." I wanted to argue, to claim that some wound inside me still needed balancing. But when she smiled, tired but proud, I let the fight go. Maybe she was right. Maybe the best revenge was never needing them again. A week later, I left my office late and found a shadow sitting on the steps outside. Richard. His suit was wrinkled, his hair wild like he had been pulling at it. He didn't look up as I approached. He just sat there, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. Beside him was a folded piece of paper. I walked past him, unlocked the door, but something in me made me pick it up. In his handwriting were the words, "Family is more important than pride." I didn't hesitate. I crumpled it in my hand, walked inside, and tossed it straight into the trash. He never knocked. He never called out my name. He just sat there as I closed the door behind me. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what he wanted. I only cared about the silence that finally belonged to me. The new year began with a clarity I had never known. By the time the snow melted off the sidewalks of Chicago, I had already booked 3 weeks in Japan with Ethan Ross. It was the same money I once reserved for David and Olivia's emergencies, the same fund I used to carry like a chain around my neck. This time it was mine, and I was finally ready to spend it without guilt. Tokyo was the first stop. Neon lights stretched endlessly above us, streets alive at every hour. I walked through Shibuya Crossing, surrounded by thousands of strangers, and felt weightless, anonymous, unburdened. Ethan laughed as we squeezed into tiny ramen shops, where steam fogged the windows, our chopsticks clumsy but determined. I thought about how many times I had eaten at family dinners pretending to be grateful while swallowing resentment with every bite. Here, halfway across the world, each meal felt like freedom served in a bowl. Kyoto slowed us down. We rented bicycles and pedaled past temples wrapped in morning mist. The bells rang low and steady, echoing against the hills. I stopped in front of a shrine tracing the wooden beams worn smooth by centuries of hands. There was no family name carved into it, no obligation, no manipulation. It was just history and silence, and for the first time I let myself believe I belonged to something larger than the Bennett's endless drama. Osaka brought color and laughter. Street vendors handed us skewers of takoyaki still sizzling the air thick with the smell of soy and ginger. We watched performers juggle fire by the river, children cheering as sparks lit up the night. I caught myself smiling, not the practiced grin I had perfected at family gatherings, but a smile that reached all the way to my chest. Ethan nudged me and said I looked 10 years younger. Maybe I did. I felt lighter with every day that passed. On the last night in Japan, I stood on a bridge in Osaka, watching the city lights ripple across the water. Ethan leaned beside me, quiet, his hands in his pockets. We did not need words. The silence was enough. I had learned that revenge was not in crushing them, not in exposing every lie, but in walking away with peace they could never steal. When we returned to Illinois, the city felt different. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. My apartment no longer looked like a place of exile, but a space that was mine, walls filled with choices I had made for myself. Emily started spending more time with me, first for coffee, then for dinners that stretched late into the night. She asked about Japan, about what it felt like to breathe without the shadow of my family pressing down. I told her the truth. It felt like waking up after years of holding my breath. One evening we walked through Lincoln Park just as the sun set. She slipped her hand into mine, and I realized I did not need to search for belonging in people who had already shown me I was disposable. Belonging was here in the simple rhythm of her fingers brushing against mine, in the warmth of someone who chose me without conditions. Spring came, and with it a new rhythm. I cut the last financial ties that connected me to Richard. My name was no longer attached to his accounts, no longer listed as the emergency contact on family forms. When Margaret called, I let it ring. When David sent a message asking if I could talk, I left it unread. The silence was not cruel. It was necessary. Emily and I grew into something steady. She teased me out of my shell, convinced me to paint my living room a bold blue instead of keeping it gray, taught me that freedom was not just about walking away, but about allowing joy back in. I found myself cooking again, not because it was expected at family gatherings, but because I wanted to see her smile over a plate of pasta I had made. Late one night, I sat on my balcony overlooking the quiet streets and thought about the boy I had once been. The boy who sat at his brother's wedding, shoved next to the catering staff because his father decided he was not worthy of a seat at the family table. I remembered how I had smiled then, forcing it so no one would see the crack inside me. That smile had been survival. The smile I wore now was different. It was real. My father could force me to sit with servers on a day that was supposed to celebrate family. He could strip me of dignity in front of 300 guests. But he could never take away the life I had built once I walked away. The only smile that mattered was the one I carried now, not in defiance, but in freedom. If you have ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to love you, if you have ever been treated as less at your own family's table, remember this. You do not need their permission to stand. You do not need their validation to smile. You have the right to walk away, to find your own silence, and to live as yourself. And when you do that, smile will be the truest one of all.